Hello, everyone, and welcome into the Star Wars Legends Lounge, the show that celebrates the books from Star Wars Legends. I'm Aaron Motes. The Major League Baseball playoffs have begun, and for the second straight year, the Baltimore Orioles were swept out of the first round. I try not to let it get me down, but it is tough. It's tough. Anyway, I'm back home after spending the last 3 months on deployment in the Middle East. It's great to be back home, and it's great to get back to doing the podcast. Today's book is another one of the Legends short story compilations, Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, edited by Kevin J. Anderson. The book contains 16 short stories featuring the background characters standing around the Cantina bar where Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi meet Han Solo and Chewbacca in A New Hope. But before I get into the book, let's take a couple listener emails. The first comes from listener Caleb, who says, I love your show. I found it after listening to the Darth Bane trilogy audiobooks, and liked it so much, I decided to become a regular listener. For a Star Wars fan, this is a great way to get a preview of books I'm on the edge about reading, and it's a good way to gain info on blind spots in my knowledge. My question, if Lucasfilm gave you free rein to make your version of the sequel trilogy, what would it be like? Would it be animated? A live-action film? A comic? Novel? What would the story be about? Who are the main heroes? Who are the main villains? And if you could take inspiration from one EU project, which one? Well, thank you very much for the email, Caleb. I'm glad you enjoy the show. I don't want this answer to be kind of a cop-out, but I'll be honest, I've never imagined making my own Star Wars movie or show. I don't have an artistic mind. My mind is much more analytical. I'm not going to lie and say that I thought the sequel trilogy was awesome, because there are a lot of things in those movies that don't work for me. But I did love some of the characters, mainly Rey and Finn. I guess if I could change something about the movies, it would be to keep the focus on the films on them for the entire trilogy. I'm not as big a fan of Ben Solo / Kylo Ren, but I do think the character is interesting enough to keep him as the main antagonist of the trilogy. And I mean that. No Emperor Palpatine clone. Just keep Kylo Ren as the main bad guy. And maybe make him the leader of a faction that's not the First Order. For me, I didn't like how closely the First Order was to the Empire of the original trilogy. Now, as for incorporating a storyline from Legends into the sequel trilogy, honestly, I don't know if anything would really fit. Maybe the closest thing would be some sort of Force cult that's wreaking havoc in the unknown regions or in wild space. Similar to the cult on Crescia Station in The Crystal Star, but with Kylo Ren as its leader instead of Waru. I mean, the Sith Eternal were basically a Force cult. Maybe have Kylo Ren leading them as the main faction that's against our heroes. Now that I'm saying it out loud, that doesn't really sound very good, but that's all I could really come up with, Caleb. So, thank you again for the question, but as you and the listeners just heard, you definitely do not want me pitching a Star Wars story to Lucasfilm. Today's second email is an audio submission from Nicholas in Germany.
First off, I want to thank you for the show. I have been listening for almost 2 years now, I think. And I especially enjoy your very calm presentation style, which is a nice piece of change from the podcast I usually listen to. So yes, thank you for many hours of great entertainment. Which brings me to my question. So my question is as follows. I've recently finished watching the Bad Batch, where we get a clone perspective on Order 66 and the formation of the Empire. So what I want to know is your thoughts on this canon clone perspective on Order 66 and how it compares to what we saw in Legends, while the clones reacted to Order 66 and the formation of the Empire there. Do you prefer one of these depictions? Is there something you particularly enjoyed about the canon one or the Legends one? Or is this something you particularly disliked? I'm looking forward to your thoughts, and have a nice day.
Well, thank you for the kind words, Nicholas. And thank you so much for submitting the audio question. I guess the biggest difference between Order 66 in Legends and in canon is the inhibitor chips embedded in the heads of the clones. That's the canon explanation of why all the clones turned all of the sudden against the Jedi. In Legends, the clones don't have those inhibitor chips. They turn because of their training. They must follow the orders of the Chancellor. Now, personally, that has never sat well with me, whether it was on screen in Revenge of the Sith or in the subsequent Legends stories and comics or in the video games. I have a hard time believing that all the clones would simply ignore the camaraderie that they had built up fighting alongside the Jedi for 3 years just to turn around and fire on them. Again, that has never sat well with me. Personally, I prefer the use of the inhibitor chips in canon. To me, that better explains why the clones just automatically turn. Plus, I think it's darkly poetic how the clones go from hating the droids they've been fighting against to basically becoming droids themselves in that moment. It really is tragic. Thank you very much for the question, Nicholas. Now, listener, if you have a question for the show, like Caleb and Nicholas, you can email me at swlegendslounge@gmail.com or send me a message on Twitter, Instagram, or Blue Sky at swlegendslounge. And if you'd like to get your voice on the show, just record a short message like Nicholas did and email it in. But please record it in MP3 audio format. Listener, coming up at the end of the show, I've got a new Star Wars character grouping to share with you. And I have a listener comment about something from The Rise of Skywalker. You'll want to stick around for that. But now it's time for today's book, Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, edited by Kevin J. Anderson. Now, today's episode is going to be a little different from our usual book discussion. If any of you listened to the episode about the book Tales of the Bounty Hunters, you know that I did a brief summary of each story in that book. But that was only 5 stories. This book has 16. I'm not going to summarize all 16 short stories in this book. That would get monotonous. It would get repetitive. And it would just be plain boring. And nobody wants to hear that. I don't want to do that. Instead, I'm going to talk about the 3 stories that I like the most, and then I'll hit a few stories that didn't really work for me. Sound good? Awesome. Listener, grab yourself a drink. Let's head in to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. Let me start with the first story in the book, We Don't Do Weddings, The Band's Tale, by Kathy Tyers. Now, everyone has their favorite minor character in Star Wars. Some weird-looking alien, or a funny-looking person, or just some interesting-looking background character. And we all know the term for them. I'm not going to use it here because this is a family podcast. But full disclosure, my glup blank is the Cantina Band. Figrin' Dan and the Modal Nodes. I love them, always have, always will. This story tells the tale of the Cantina band trying to get away from Jabba the Hutt and off Tatooine. But first, they need to make some money. And what's holding them back? Well, Figrin' Dan himself. Because the band leader has a bit of a gambling problem. The problem is that he's a really bad gambler. And he keeps losing the money that the band gets paid from their gig at Jabba's palace. Now, Jabba has a reputation. The Hutt gangster loves his music, but eventually he gets tired of the talent and then drops them into the Rancor pit below his dais. So, the band knows that their time is probably running out. The modal nodes agree to take a gig playing for Lady Valerian's wedding. Now, the Whippet is the main criminal rival of Jabba the Hutt on Tatooine. The modal nodes understand that by taking the gig for Lady Valerian, they've signed their own death warrants as far as Jabba goes. But with the amount that the Whippet is paying them, the band can pay for transport off planet and head toward the core. The gig goes wrong, of course. Jabba learns that the modal nodes are playing the wedding, and he sends some of his thugs to break up the ceremony. They do, and in the resulting shootout, a squad of stormtroopers arrives, which just adds to the blaster fire. Now, in the chaos, the modal nodes grab their instruments and flee. They sprint through the streets and run into Wooher, the bartender from Chalmun's Cantina. Wooher tells the Bith that Chalmun is looking for a house band, and the modal nodes jump at the opportunity. But they make sure that Wooher knows, as soon as they make enough money, they're leaving Tatooine. So, what I like about this story is that coming out of watching A New Hope, when it comes to the Cantina, everyone gets the band's first song stuck in their head. Of course, they do have a second song, but not as many people remember that one. But the band is cool. The band is fun. And that's what most people remember. I like the fact that in this story, Kathy Tyers makes Figrin' Dan, the leader of the band, someone that the rest of the members have an issue with. Figrin' Dan is bad with money. Figrin' Dan is a bad gambler. The rest of the band just wants to play their gig, make memorable music, get paid, and move on to the next gig. But Figrin' Dan is almost like a weight pulling them down. They love him. The rest of the band members really like their band leader, but they're so frustrated with him. It's exasperating to have someone that you like this much. They just have this one character flaw that really messes up what everyone else wants to do. Figrin' Dan likes gambling. He's terrible at it. He constantly loses their money. And there's a little bit of slapstick comedy depending on how you read this story. I can just imagine at Lady Valerian's wedding, when Jabba's thugs show up, hijinks ensue. Then a squad of stormtroopers show up. More hijinks ensue. Someone's throwing the wedding cake. And in the chaos, you look over to the side and you see Figrin' Dan and the modal nodes hurriedly trying to gather up their instruments and run out before something happens to them. I don't know why I read this story that way, but I do. It seems slapsticky, and I liked it. It's not the deepest story in this collection, but this story is just fun, and that's why I like it. So moving on, the second story I want to talk about is called Play It Again, Figurin' Dan, The Tale of Muftak and Kabe by A.C. Crispin. It's the story of the big, white, fuzzy Talls and the little Rainat. Now, we learn at the beginning of the story that Muftak is an orphan. He doesn't know what species he is. Nobody on Tatooine knows what he is, and nobody can help him figure out where his species' homeworld is. Because of the way he grew up on Tatooine, Muftak has a soft spot for other orphans. Well, send in Kabe, an orphaned Rainat that Muftak found as a child huddled in an alley. Now the two are inseparable and making their way through the seedy underbelly of Mos Eisley. As they walk toward their favorite watering hole, Muftak is stopped by a squad of stormtroopers. "Hey, Talls," one of them says. "We're looking for a pair of droids. Have you seen any around here?" Muftak says that he hasn't, but he focuses on what the stormtrooper called him, a Talls. Now, what is that? Is that what I am? Muftak decides to ask the smartest person he knows, Momal Nadin. He finds the old Ithorian in his usual booth at Chalmun's Cantina. Unfortunately, Momal can't help Muftak. He's never heard of the Talls species, but he wishes Muftak the best in searching out which planet the Talls species is located on. Now, while they talk, Kabe orders a drink from Wooher the bartender and starts scoping out her next mark when she witnesses Dr. Evazan and Ponda Baba in a fight with an old man and a boy. The skirmish ends with the old man brandishing a glowing sword and Ponda Baba's arm on the floor. As the night ends and the two return to their apartment, Muftak tells Kabe he wants to find the Talls' homeworld. To do that, Muftak agrees to something Kabe has always pestered him about in the past: rob Jabba the Hutt's Mos Eisley townhouse. The next night, the two break into the building and start taking some of the valuables the crime lord has kept there. Now, behind a locked door, Kabe finds a human strapped down to a torture table. The man identifies himself as a rebel. Kabe tries to free the man, but he's too injured to escape. The man gives Muftak a data disk and says the rebellion will pay them 30,000 credits for that information. Muftak and Kabe turn to leave when a pair of Jabba's guards arrive. A blaster fight ensues, and eventually a fire starts. Now the two thieves escape, but they lose the bag of loot they took from the townhouse. However, Muftak still has the data disk. Now they find the man's contact and sell the disk for 15,000 credits and 2 letters of transit signed by Grand Moff Tarkin himself. The two now have money and tickets off Tatooine. This is your typical Star Wars found family story. Muftak was an orphan on Tatooine. It's the only place he knows. Doesn't know what species he is, and no one else can help him with that. As an orphan, he has a soft spot for other orphans, and when he finds Kabe, Muftak takes her in and raises her and protects her. I like the camaraderie between the two. Kabe is very energetic. She's very sarcastic. She keeps wanting to push Muftak into doing more and more risky things. Whether it's whose pockets they try to pick in Mos Eisley, or when it comes to something really big like breaking into Jabba the Hutt's townhouse and stealing some of the crime lord's valuables. Muftak is much calmer, much more level-headed, tries to make Kabe think about what she's wanting to do, but all the while you can tell that Muftak is proud of the little Rainat. The one thing that doesn't work for me in this story is how nobody has ever heard of the Tal's species. Personally, I don't think that's something that would happen in a place with so many aliens as Mos Eisley. I think there's more Tals out there running around the galaxy that somebody there would have seen them before. Now, maybe they may not have known where the Tal's homeworld is, Alzak 3, but I think someone would have, if not interacted with, at least known of the Tal species. It would be one little point against in this story. But I really like how Muftak and Kabe play off each other. I like their caper, breaking into Jabba's townhouse, going through his valuables, eventually discovering the human who's strapped to the torture table. In the end, they get what they want. They're able to escape Tatooine. And with the letters of transit, they can go wherever they want. It's left kind of open-ended, but it seems like Muftak at least is going to try to find out where the Tal's homeworld is. I wonder how long letters of transit are good for. Are they good for a certain amount of time? Are they good for a certain number of trips? Are they good indefinitely? Especially as long as Grand Moff Tarkin is alive. Which, if we know A New Hope, that's not going to last much longer from where this story ends. I don't know. That'd be something interesting to find out. How long do Imperial letters of transit last? That's not important to the story. What's important to the story is we have another example of a found family. They can bicker, they can argue, they can disagree. They clearly love each other. They work through their issues, and in the end, they achieve their objective. Now, the final story I want to highlight is called Drawing the Maps of Peace, The Moisture Farmer's Tale by M. Shane Bell. Eric Johnson is a moisture farmer living on the edge of the Dune Sea. He discovers that a band of Tusken Raiders have attacked one of his moisture evaporators, attempting to break it open and get to the water. Johnson realizes that the Sand People were most likely collecting water in this area themselves before he set up the evaporators and started harvesting it. So he decides to open this one evaporator and offer it to the Tuskens. When they return and find the water, they pour it into an animal skin pouch and then turn to stare at Johnson. One of the Tuskens raises its fist in the air. After a bit of hesitation, Johnson does likewise. They stay like that for a moment, and then the Sand People turn and vanish back into the desert. After the encounter, Johnson decides that the only way for the moisture farmers to live in peace with the Sand People is to draw a map accepted by the Imperials. He divides the map surrounding his farm into 3 parts. One showing the land for the moisture farmers, one for the Jawas, and one for the Sand People. But Johnson knows his map isn't going to be popular. Most of the neighboring moisture farmers want the Tuskens and the Jawas pushed even farther out into the Dune Sea. But Johnson believes that dividing the land is the only way to ensure peace for the farmers. He starts by visiting the Jawas in a nearby fortress. Johnson shows the map to one of their elders and convinces him that peace is a good idea. Later, Johnson visits his neighbor, Eyvind, who introduces him to his fiancée, Ariella, a woman from Alderaan. Eyvind is against the plan, as are most of the farmers. But Ariella supports Johnson. As a show of goodwill, Ariella invites the Jawas to her and Eyvind's wedding. The wedding starts off well, but soon a group of young Tuskens appear and start shooting. In the commotion, the Tuskens kill Eyvind and kidnap Ariella. Johnson quickly sets out to rescue her with the Jawa elder by his side. Johnson heads to the evaporator where he leaves water for the Sand People. There, he finds the Tuskens. Johnson makes a trade to free Ariella and uses it as an opportunity to explain his plans for peace to the Sand People. It seems like the map might work, when suddenly a squad of Imperials arrive and start firing on the Tuskens. The other farmers called them after what happened at the wedding. The Imperials chase the Tuskens away and tell Johnson that for his safety, he'll have to leave his moisture farm and stay in Mos Eisley for a few days. Johnson stops for a drink in Chalmun's cantina to think about what just happened. He realizes that the Tuskens aren't the real threat to peace on Tatooine. It's the Empire. The Imperials want conflict so that the farmers will always welcome the Empire to come in and impose its version of order. Johnson realizes that the only route to peace is to fight the Empire. He downs his drink and decides to join the Rebel Alliance. So, I think it's easy to understand why I like this story. This era of Star Wars, the Imperial/Rebellion era, is my favorite era. And almost any story about fighting the Empire is going to work for me. This is one of the early stories where we just see the oppressive nature of the Empire. There's no named villain. There's no big bad. Darth Vader is not here. Emperor Palpatine is not here. Grand Moff Tarkin is not here. The villain is simply Imperial oppression. Here we have a moisture farmer that's trying to take it upon himself to broker a peace with the other species that are living where he lives. I'm not saying he's trying to live in harmony with the Jawas or the Tuskens, but he's at least trying to broker some sort of truce so that the three sides aren't fighting for resources all the time. That between the farmers and the Tuskens, they're not trying to kill each other, with the Jawas sometimes in the middle. If Johnson is able to broker this peace, then none of these factions will need to have the Empire there maintaining the truce, maintaining security. But that's not what the Empire wants. The Empire wants the farmers to be afraid of the Tuskens. The Empire wants the farmers to look down upon the Jawas and to look down upon the Tuskens. The Empire wants the three factions to be in conflict because if they are in conflict, now the farmers need the Imperials to be there to enforce law and order, to enforce peace. But what is that peace? It's peace on the Empire's terms. By the end of the story, that's what Johnson is able to realize. What are we willing to give up for that peace? What are we willing to give up for the order that the Empire is offering? These are the types of stories that are some of my favorite. in Star Wars. And that's why this is probably my favorite story in the book. Time to take a break. When I return, I'll talk more about Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina. I'm Aaron Moats. Stay tuned. You're listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. Thank you for listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge, where we celebrate the books from Star Wars Legends. But allow me to recommend a book from Star Wars canon. Catalyst, a Rogue One novel, is the story of Galen Erso, Orson Krennic, and the construction of the first Death Star. It's a story of intrigue, betrayal, and how a friendship can be destroyed. An essential story leading up to Rogue One, a Star Wars story. Check out Catalyst, a Rogue One novel by James Luceno. Welcome back to the Star Wars Legends Lounge, the show that celebrates the books from Star Wars Legends. I'm Aaron Moats, and today I'm talking about Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, one of the Legends character anthology books, edited by Kevin J. Anderson. In the first part of the show, I talked about 3 of the stories I really liked in this book. Now, I'm briefly going to talk about a couple of stories that don't work for me. The first is called Hammer Tong, The Tale of the Tonica Sisters by Timothy Zahn. Now look, I know what you're thinking. Yes, I really like Timothy Zahn. But one of the few things that Zahn does in his Star Wars writing that I'm not a big fan of is how much he relies on the characters that he creates. And that's what he does in this story. Because in this story, the Tonica sisters aren't really the Tonica sisters. The women we see in Chalmun's Cantina are actually a pair of Mistral Shadow Guards, Shada Dukal and Karoli Dulin. They're undercover, transporting a top-secret Imperial project called Hammer Tong. But the Mistrals are attacked. They steal the Imperial cruiser and head to Tatooine. Shada and Karoli are arrested in Chalmun's Cantina after witnessing Luke and Obi-Wan's confrontation with Dr. Evazan and Ponda Baba. While in jail, the Mistrals are freed by a rebel officer who is impersonating an Imperial officer. Shada and Karoli take the rebel to where they crash the cruiser out in the Dune Sea. The rebel tells them that Hammer Tong is actually part of the super laser for the second Death Star that the Empire is building. He asks to take Hammer Tong, but the Mistrals refuse. They launch the Imperial cruiser and head home to their planet, Emberline. So, I was very brief on that synopsis. As I said, I was not a fan of this story. I did not like the fact that Zahn made the Tonica sisters the 2 Mistral Shadow Guards. I wish they would have just been the Tonica sisters, because I think their story in Legends is interesting in and of itself. They're con artists. They run some scams against some high society targets. They run a confidence scheme against a Moff and cheat him out of 25,000 credits. I wish Zahn would have just used them that way. Instead of it being Shada and Karoli, just let it be Bria and Seni Tonica. As much as I like Timothy Zahn's writing, and I do. I like him a lot. I think Zahn is one of the better authors in Star Wars. One of the few things he does that occasionally rubs me the wrong way is what I believe is his over-reliance on characters that he has created. Almost like he's carved out his own little niche in Star Wars and That's where he likes to play, and no one else can play there. So, this story, not a fan. The other story that didn't really work for me is called Dr. Death, The Tale of Dr. Evazan and Ponda Baba by Kenneth C. Flint. It's really the only story in the collection that doesn't orbit the scene from Chalmun's Cantina. It references it, but the story takes place a few years in the future. It takes place on the water planet of Ando. Dr. Evazan believes he's close to discovering the secret of eternal life. All he needs is a little more funding. The doctor asks an Aqualish senator for the money, but the senator, who is a member of the Aqualish higher caste, is reluctant. As Evazan continues his pitch, a group of 4 mercenaries storm his lab and try to kill him. But they can't get past Evazan's security measures. 3 of the mercenaries are killed, and the 4th is taken into custody by Ponda Baba, Evazan's partner, bodyguard, and a member of the Aqualish lower caste. Now, Evazan decides to use the mercenary to finish his experiment, but not before he decides, I'm going to use the senator too. Because the doctor's solution to eternal life is to transfer a being's consciousness into a different, more desirable body. Evazan tries to transfer Ponda Baba's consciousness into the senator. But the experiment backfires. Or, more precisely, it works backwards. Because the senator's consciousness gets transferred into Ponda Baba. Now, having lost his status as a member of the higher caste, the senator tries to blow up the lab. The explosion kills the senator, who is of course the new Ponda Baba, but it fails to kill the evil Dr. Evazan. The reason this story didn't work for me is because I've never really had that much interest in the characters of Dr. Evazan and Ponda Baba. I also think, considering the other 15 stories in this book at least orbit the main scene in the Mos Eisley Cantina, I thought it was a little odd that this story didn't. That this story just mentions it, but that's it. I mean, heck, a lot of the stories in this book are intertwined. Greedo's story, Wooher's story, Muftak Kabe, Momal Naden. There's a story from one of the stormtroopers' points of view. Some of these stories intertwine. You can tell that the authors communicated with each other. That's not to say that the stories that don't intertwine are any less. They're not. In fact, I highlighted 2 of them that I really liked. And they're not really intertwined with any of the rest of them. But I do think if the story is going to be in the Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, that scene should play a role in the story. The only reason that scene plays a role in this story is they mentioned that Ponda Baba now has an artificial arm. The other reason I'm not a big fan of this story, and this is honestly probably the main reason, is I've never really liked stories about the search for eternal life. Maybe that's why I've never been a fan of the story about Palpatine trying to lengthen his life through various cloning techniques. I mean, that's a storyline that's been done in both Legends and now canon, and I've never been interested in either of them. So, Dr. Evazan, Ponda Baba, 2 characters I've never really cared for. A story about the transfer of consciousness between bodies in order to achieve eternal life, I've never been a fan of. And then I just don't think this story really revolves much around the scene from A New Hope in the Mos Eisley Cantina. That's why this story doesn't work for me. Well, it's almost time to go, but first, I've got a new Star Wars character grouping to share with you. It's from Caleb, who sent in his ideal Star Wars road trip crew. Caleb says, the driver would be Han Solo, Qui-Gon Jinn, the navigator, Max Rebo would be manning the radio. Caleb says that in his experience, people who make music know good music when they hear it. Grease from the Jedi Fallen Order video games would be the person bringing the snacks. And then the trip planner would be Luke Skywalker. Great list, Caleb. Thank you for sharing it with me. Now, finally today, I received an email from someone about The Rise of Skywalker. Joe has an opinion about the movie, about something that he doesn't agree with. Joe says, if I could get rid of one thing from canon, it would be Rey being a Palpatine. I know The Rise of Skywalker has some flaws, but I think the biggest one is making Rey's past more involved in the timeline. I liked her story much more when she was no one, as Kylo Ren told her. I thought it was a more powerful narrative for her to be a random hero that found her power. I think it's kind of a cop-out for her to be more connected to a powerful source, because it also means she isn't powerful on her own. It's because of who she's related to. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts with me, Joe. There are a lot of people that share that opinion with you. Now, listener, if you have an opinion that you'd like to share with me about Star Wars, or about something I've said on the show, or if you'd like to submit a Star Wars character grouping, email me at swlegendslounge@gmail.com, or send me a message on Twitter, Instagram, or Blue Sky at swlegendslounge. And of course, send in your questions. I love hearing from you. Now, coming up with the next episode, we'll be traveling back a little more than a decade to check in on everyone's favorite scruffy-looking nerf herder. It's the Paradise Snare by A.C. Crispin, the first book in the Han Solo trilogy. You can look forward to that episode coming out on October 18th. Thank you so much for listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. I'm Aaron Motes. May the Force be with you. And remember, there's always a bit of truth in legends.